breaking news from DawgNation.
Hello, DawgNation. Thank you so much for joining us late on a Tuesday night. I'm Kaylee Mansell with Connor Riley, and it feels like for some reason we have waited so long for these upcoming schedules to come out. Now we get Georgia's schedule from 2026 all the way through 2029. Connor, just your immediate reaction off the top.
Yeah, it's an interesting schedule for Georgia. Some funny notes about the way that it looks out. They don't have to visit Texas A&M right away. We've waited 14 years for that game to be played. What's another year there? I find it interesting that Georgia has to go to Alabama and to Ole Miss next season. They did that in 2024. They ended up losing both of those games. They do get Oklahoma at home first. This will be the first time these two teams play as conference foes in 2026. But overall, an interesting schedule for Georgia, one that feels pretty balanced for the most part. Home road splits, they are flipped in 2026 and 2028. In 2027 and 2029.
Yeah, so of course we're going to go year by year. We'll break down all of the home games and away games, but one of the things that was established off the top of the ESPN broadcast is that there are some new rules in place for the SEC schedules and kind of the reasoning behind some of those moves. So this is what they put up. Of course, there will be the three annual opponents, Georgia's being Auburn, Florida, and South Carolina. All SEC teams will play the other 12 SEC schools every 2 years, as well as visit all SEC schools and host all SEC schools on a 4-year schedule. And then, of course, you must schedule a high-quality non-conference opponent, which is 3 of the other Power 4, or they made a very specific comment for you could also play Notre Dame. That counts in that category as well. But the way that the schedules are going to work, 2026 and 2028 will just be the reverse of one another. Same with 2027 and 2029. The big thing was they wanted this to make a case for SEC teams going to the playoff. That was part of the reason they expanded to the 9 game. And then also with the schedules, before we get into it, one of the things that they talked about was the competitive balance, and even just getting a glimpse at Georgia's schedule as well as all of the other SEC schools. The only one I haven't seen this far has been Texas. There has not been a schedule so far that has jumped out to me as being too easy or too difficult. So I thought the SEC did a really good job of balancing these schedules.
Yeah, it's important to note here that the SEC, they put out some facts and figures regarding competitive balance, not wanting to make sure any one schedule is too slated. From 26 to 2029, the highest rated average opponent winning percentage is at 55.6%, and the lowest is at 46.65%. That's a massive difference from where it was from 2020 through 2023, when it was 61.3 on the high end and 39.8 on the low end. That's a lot of numbers to throw at you, but basically, a much more stratified group of measurements. Now, I find it interesting that the SEC did not put out the data for 2024 and 2025, which has created, I believe, some schedule imbalance when you look at the way that teams are playing and the schedules that people have to face. I think one thing that's important to keep in mind here is that Georgia can't play itself on its schedule. And so that is going to tilt things in an obvious way, where for a lot of programs, Georgia is the marquee opponent on their schedule and the best team they face. So Georgia's schedule is a little bit more, I think, difficult simply because of the fact that Georgia is good. They are paying a Georgia is good tax in that sense. But overall, as we get into it here, I do think that these schedules are a little bit more balanced. Whether or not that ends up getting more teams in the college football playoff, we'll see. I don't necessarily agree with that, just given how much more difficult I think it is to beat an SEC team rather than go out and win in the non-conference. You've seen so far early this season, the SEC has been the best conference in terms of facing and beating other Power 4 conferences. And so I'll be interested to see if this gambit that the SEC has made ends up working out in their favor.
All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and get into Georgia's 2026 schedule. They're going to host Auburn at home, Missouri at home, Vanderbilt at home, Oklahoma at home, and then we're going to count the Georgia-Florida game in Atlanta as also a home game. And then they're going to go on the road to South Carolina, to Alabama, to Arkansas, and to Ole Miss. Now, with the exception of maybe Auburn and Oklahoma, I wouldn't say that there's a home game on the schedule that feels nearly as big as any of the ones they have on their current schedule. I definitely think that the away games are tougher than what they have at home, but of course you technically do have more home matchups here. But having to go back to Alabama, and I think that you said this off the top too, having to go back to Alabama next year, that was probably the thing on this schedule that surprised me the most.
Yeah, specifically, I think if you could have slotted in at Texas A&M instead of at Alabama, I think the schedule makes a lot more sense. We'll see why the SEC ultimately elected to go with that matchup there in the way that they have. Look, Alabama and Georgia, it's always big numbers, big ratings when these two teams play, when they match up. Oscar Delp said tonight, in his lifetime, the SEC has run through Georgia and Alabama, and that's been the case. 2019, the only time in the past decade that neither Georgia or Alabama has won the SEC championship. And so looking at the schedule, I do think the Oklahoma game will be a big game. I like to think that that game's probably early in the season. They try and build off some of the mystique. It's the first time Oklahoma has ever played at Sanford Stadium. Obviously, they're on a hot streak right now with coming off the win over Auburn. We'll see what ends up happening to them this season. John Mateer currently dealing with a thumb injury. He's going to knock him out a few weeks. But for this 2026 schedule, it is balanced, I think, maybe with the exception of having to go to Alabama. But overall, I think that is an easier schedule on aggregate than certainly what Georgia had a year ago when they were going to Ole Miss with the best team they've had in a while, to Alabama, to Texas, and to Kentucky. I do think that this is a more balanced schedule, and you see that this first year in 2026.
Yeah, and of course the dates were not released tonight. I do believe they said on the broadcast it would be sometime in December, but I do think that's where the balance comes in with what you talked about with the difficult away games that you have. You make up for it with some easier home opponents, and of course we don't know what's going to happen with Georgia's home streak this season, but if for some reason they're able to pull that out, I think you feel really good about what you have in your home games.
Yeah, and so again, with what you see there, Missouri should be a game you win. Vanderbilt should be a game you win just based on history and what you've seen there. Georgia's dominated Auburn at home of late. And if you win your home games and you look at that schedule there, they still have some accounting to do in 2026 in terms of figuring out the way their non-conference is going to look, because as the SEC moves to a 9-game schedule, they currently have 4 non-conference games scheduled. So one of Tennessee State, Louisville, or Western Kentucky is going to have to be dropped. They're obviously going to continue to play Georgia Tech. Keeping Georgia Tech on the schedule satisfies the SEC's other requirement that you play one Power Four or Notre Dame in the non-conference there. So I'll be curious to see when that ends up coming down and what ends up happening specifically with that Louisville game, because it does feel a little superfluous with Georgia Tech on the schedule.
All right, so now let's talk about 2027. This is where I feel like the schedule starts to get a little bit more difficult. Now, they have some really big games at home: South Carolina at home, LSU at home, also get Mississippi State, and then Tennessee. I know a lot of fans were sad to see that rivalry go away with the annual opponent. But then you look at the away games. Okay, you go to Auburn on the road, you go to Kentucky on the road, you're going to play Florida and Tampa. But Georgia has to go to Texas A&M and Texas in the same year. They're going to make the trip to Texas A&M, but I feel like that's just so brutal from a fan perspective to have Georgia go to Texas A&M and Texas in the same year. I probably would have liked to see that split, but I feel like the SEC said, well, you know what? You get to host LSU at home, you get to host Tennessee at home, so you got to make up for it somehow, and that's why they sent Georgia on the road to both Texas and Texas A&M in this instance.
Can I ask you, Kaylee, if you switch Texas A&M and put them on the 26 schedule, and you put Alabama on the 27 schedule, do you prefer that schedule? Because you have to go to Auburn, you have to go to Alabama, you have to go to Texas. I do think with the way that it's laid out, it is a little bit of an easier schedule in both years rather than flipping that around, because having to go to Alabama, to Texas, we know how difficult it is to play on the road at Auburn for this team. I do think, and I can understand where you're coming from, because those are going to be long trips. I'd be shocked from a scheduling standpoint if one of those games isn't before Georgia's bye week, which traditionally comes before Florida in late October. You do have to make long trips there, but at the same point in time, in 2026, let's say you put A&M on there, that trip to Arkansas is very long. So no matter, I think, what you do here, and I think this shows just how balanced the schedules are as a whole, kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, depending on the way this thing goes.
However, if you're looking far enough into the future, you realize that it all comes back to you in 2029 when you get to host the both of them. So at the end of the day, I do feel like this is the more difficult schedule between 2026 and 2027, but it's a lot more exciting for Georgia fans. It just feels like there's games of bigger magnitude. We can go ahead and move on to 2028, which is essentially just the reverse of 2026. So you get to have Auburn at home, Ole Miss at home, Alabama at home, also get to have Arkansas, and then Florida and Georgia will return to Jacksonville. This kind of feels a little bit more to me like this year's schedule when you look at the home games, and then the away games go back to South Carolina, Vanderbilt, Oklahoma, Missouri. Way bigger home schedule, probably a little bit more difficult than the away side, but that's some really big games to host at home for 2028.
Yeah, and I think the 2028 schedule from a travel standpoint, I think should excite Georgia
Mm-hmm.
fans. You get at Missouri, a place you've had a ton of success at. At Vanderbilt, it's always a fun trip to go to Nashville. You get that first trip to Oklahoma. I know that's a game a lot of people are going to be circled and looking forward to there. And then depending on where you live in the state, South Carolina could potentially be a day trip depending on what time of that game is played. So I think from a feasibility standpoint, and then you obviously mentioned the home schedule there. I think the 2028 schedule is certainly one of the more attractive ones in terms of if you're going to try and go to
Yeah.
multiple games, you've got a lot to pick from in terms of experiences. While also not necessarily having the most difficult road schedule there, Georgia should be a naturally more talented team than South Carolina, Vanderbilt, and Missouri. And who knows what that Oklahoma team ultimately looks like, because they're going to have a continuously difficult schedule this year under Brett Venables, and what that program is going to look like at that point in time.
And I know a lot of Georgia fans are excited about the idea of just going to Texas A&M because it hasn't happened before. But I think at least for me, the one game that I'm most excited to go on the road to see is Oklahoma because of the tradition there. And also because Georgia was initially supposed to play in a series with Oklahoma. Then you find out they're coming to the SEC. And so it made sense to cancel that game. But I think for me, out of all of the games and the way things are laid out, that's the trip I would be the most excited to make.
See, the one I am the most excited and the most interested is the one Georgia's going to have to wait the longest to make. That's on the 2029 schedule. Yeah. Georgia returns to LSU. They have not been to LSU since 2018. It was a game Georgia got run off the field by LSU that day. Tiger Stadium, a tough place to play. That's a game I'm really looking forward to there. And along with going on the road to Tennessee, that's a game where you saw last week the atmosphere in Neyland is top notch. That is a tricky road schedule. At Auburn, at LSU, Mississippi State, we'll see, at Tennessee. Now, you do get, I think, a great home schedule with Texas A&M in Texas coming in. We're going to see Texas and Georgia play in Athens later this year. And I have to imagine with the trajectory that both these programs are on, it's going to continue to be a tightly contested battle when these two teams meet.
Yeah, that's a really desirable home schedule to host both of those schools. Now, I think the biggest surprise for me whenever the schedules came out, I felt really good about the fact that Georgia was going to have to play LSU next year. Like, it feels like that's a game that's been waiting to happen, and I thought that they would make the trip to Death Valley next year. So to see that game so far away, I think that was one of the biggest surprises to me when these schedules got released, because I was sure that the SEC was going to find a way to make sure that Georgia had to go play at LSU as a night game really, really soon, while they know for sure that Kirby Smart is still the coach at Georgia.
Right. 2029, I think it'd be year 13, 14 for Kirby Smart at Georgia. Mark Richt was only at Georgia for 15 years. Obviously, Kirby's been more successful than Mark Richt has, but it's rare to see coaches spend that much time at one program. And obviously, we're not pushing Kirby off into the sunset anytime soon here. But with that game being in 2029, I am like you, Kaylee, a little surprised they're going to have to wait that long for it, just because, again, there's a case to be made that Tiger Stadium, Death Valley, is the most iconic venue in college football. And so to have that to be pushed off for so long, you understand from a Georgia fan that wants to go down and see New Orleans, see Baton Rouge, and play in that game, that's one you're going to have to wait a long time for, and I'll be interested in seeing what that wait ultimately looks like.
Just kind of like my overarching thoughts about the schedules in general. I feel like moving forward now, there's no such thing as what we would view as an easy SEC schedule. I think there are some that will be easier than others. And of course, these games are now scheduled so far in advance. There could be talent shifts among schools. Some could get better, some could get worse. We don't know what these teams are going to look like, especially in the 2028, 2029. But I do think they did a good job with the competitive balance. It's not like a Texas schedule that we've been complaining about for the last 2 years, and maybe that's part of the reason that they decided to take that seriously this year, because of the criticism that they came under, rightfully so. And then the one thing that you said, I believe it was earlier, I don't think I made this up in my head, they made a really big deal about this being part of the reason that they wanted to, was because they wanted to get more teams in the playoff. But then we saw last year that losses were a really important thing to the committee. And now with the 9-game schedule, I mean, there's bound to be more losses in general, especially when you're playing a different rotation of teams. It becomes a little bit harder to prepare for them. So I expect to see maybe some not as pretty SEC games moving forward. So I think it's going to be one of those things that I have to believe that the committee is willing to take that that into consideration next year to believe that that's actually going to make a difference, because it's hard for me to just buy into that right now.
Yeah, the flip side of having a more balanced schedule is just that I think you're going to see a pull in towards the middle. Let's remember last year, there were, I believe, 3 or 4 teams going into that final weekend that were vying, and all had 2 losses to get into the SEC championship game. Georgia ultimately gets in on a tiebreaker. Texas went 7-1. I believe that is a byproduct of a very weak schedule they have played. And I think if you're an SEC team like a Georgia, like an Oklahoma, for instance, like a Florida that has had to play very difficult schedules the last 2 years, you're kind of like, what are we doing here? You're making this even for everyone else in a time when the last 2 years we have had, I think, a negative impact because of the schedule that we've had to play, whereas teams like Ole Miss, Missouri, Texas have benefited from playing an unbalanced SEC schedule. And I get you're just trying to make the most of a bad situation, but the league knew for years when Texas and Oklahoma were joining the league, and they had years to prepare for this. And so for this to work out in this manner, I am curious to see if this ends up having the intended effect that the SEC talking point has been, that, hey, this is going to help us get more teams into the college football playoff. Because I think last year you saw with Texas and Oklahoma joining the league as it made this league more tougher and more difficult. Alabama, chief example. If they're not playing Oklahoma at the end of the season, and instead of playing, say, a Mississippi State or a Vanderbilt, although they did find a way to lose to Vanderbilt last year, if you're not playing at Oklahoma, a program that has recruited at an elite level in recent years, Alabama's probably in the playoff. And so I do wonder if this may come home to hurt the SEC as they sort of, I think, give into the Big Ten scheduling model, because for so long they've had 9 teams. But as you and I both know, Kaylee, like the 9th best team in the SEC spends and is significantly better, in my opinion, than the 9th best team in the Big Ten. And so it is not an apples to apples comparison in my mind.
And I got to give you credit because you just came from the Tuesday night press conference with Kirby Smart, which we have now learned also that will not be happening moving forward. But I thought it was interesting that someone brought up not the future schedules, but just what the 9 game entails and how much more difficult that was. I thought that Kirby Smart did a good job of explaining it. Here's what he had to say.
No matter how you do the schedule, it's hard. I mean, it's brutal. And everybody's the same. I mean, we all got to play each other. It's really tough. Highly ranked teams, physical teams. It's just going to continue to be a grind. I mean, looking forward with the 9s coming, it's going to be scary because you just don't have enough. Nobody has enough depth. But I don't guess that really answers your question. But in terms of, do you want to be your best at the end? I think if it was a playoff system like the NFL, or a larger percentage of the teams made it, there might be decisions we made early in the season differently, knowing that we got to be at our best at the end. But if you don't get to the end with an opportunity, then do you regret what you did early? I mean, there's been decisions we've made, and decisions we probably would have made this year, if all that mattered was to win the games at the end. But the games in the beginning have just as much value as the game at the end, and you can't put yourself in a position where you can't. You don't have your best players on the field, and sometimes that takes time.
I don't know if I've ever heard Kirby Smart use the word, like the adjective scary, to describe anything, but honestly, that feels like the most simple and effective way to use that, because that was part of the reason that you and I wasn't a huge fan of introducing the 9 game schedule. I understand why they had to do it, but we've already seen how just the level of physicality in the SEC and with injuries, how that impacts teams later on in the season. And when you add that extra game, you're also having to prepare younger guys for a lot more than they're probably capable of, because you really need to reload on your depth chart. But when you hear Kirby Smart call something like the 9 game schedule scary, you better believe that he's right.
It's jarring to hear that kind of talk from Kirby, who isn't always the most inflammatory of coaches. And so, I'll be honest, sitting in that press conference, it was not exactly the most eloquent or best asked question. And I think Kirby sort of used it as an opportunity to share his thoughts on the matter. And this feels very much, again, I mentioned it earlier, like trying to have your cake and eat it too. And when they were talking and kicking around potential playoff models in the way that it looked, I actually thought from an SEC perspective, going to 4 automatic bids is maybe even the best interest for the league. As you saw last year, the league only got 3 teams into a 12-team college football playoff field, and some might say that they cheapened the regular season in doing that. But I mean, the SEC's regular season has already been cheapened to an extent with the way that they have changed the sport and the expansion that has been made to the college football playoff. So I'm going to be very interested moving forward how this continues to look, especially as we get a better understanding of what impact revenue sharing continues to have on the SEC in particular and the sport at large.
So, Connor, as we begin to wrap up, was there any final takeaways or thoughts that you had about, I mean, it could be a schedule from 1 year or just overall in general what Georgia got?
I have a question for you, Kaylee,
Sure.
to answer your own question. Which of these schedules are you most looking forward to seeing Georgia play?
Probably the one that I would view to be the toughest, maybe that 2029 one. Having South Carolina at home, having Kentucky at home, because I think that Georgia plays a lot better against Kentucky when it is played at home, but also being able to host Texas and Texas A&M and then going on the road to LSU, that's something that I've never had the opportunity to do. I know that one's so far in the future, but I do like the idea that they released these 4 games because out of all of them, I do feel like by the time we get there, this could be manageable. The only thing I don't like about it is that Georgia has to go to Tennessee, but that's just at any given time. I'd never want to go back to Knoxville. I have made that very clear. So I like the 2027, 2029 rotation better, but I feel bad for Georgia that they have to go to Texas and Texas A&M. So I would rather have those games at home for the sake of the players and also so the fans can have those 2 games there. So, I mean, out of all 4, I would probably say that 2029 would be the one that I am most looking forward to, even though we have no idea where these programs are going to be at that point in time.
Right. Yeah. It's hard to project out the way we think programs are going to look. I mean, 2 years ago, who would have said that Vanderbilt to this point in the season would be a better football team than Alabama? Now, it doesn't mean Alabama can't beat Georgia this coming weekend, but I think to answer that question myself, I think the 2027 season is the one I'm most looking forward to. In part, Florida-Georgia game that year, Georgia-Florida, we are calling this by the proper name here. That Georgia-Florida game is going to be played in Tampa that season. It is a one-off venue. It is a venue I believe Georgia has not played in since they played, I believe, is it Michigan State in the 2012 Outback Bowl when Kirk Cousins was the quarterback that day for the Michigan State Spartans, or maybe that was 2011. And they played Nebraska in 2012. That's what it was. But I think that 2027 schedule, look, in my time at college, that 2013 Georgia LSU game was the number 1 game you had to be at. You get Tennessee at home. That has been a great game for Georgia in recent years as Josh Heupel has, I think, elevated that program. And look, yes, you have to go to Texas A&M and you have to go to Texas. Those are going to be tough games, but it's the first time you'll get a chance to experience Kyle Field. And I'd say a lot of Georgia fans had a lot of fun last time they went to Texas, in Austin in particular, and had a great time with that game. And I think that 2027 game is going to be all the more highly anticipated when it rolls around.
One more final thought from me, because just now I'm excited for these places that I've never been. I get to go to a random one that I probably should have gone to at this point in time is South Carolina. The fact that Georgia goes there next year, that's a trip that I'm excited to make just because I've never been in that atmosphere before. Now, I'm probably saying this now, and then by the time we get there, it's going to be 110 degrees and there's going to be nothing in Columbia, South Carolina. But I think it's just like the idea of it and experiencing the highs and the lows of being a South Carolina fan, because I've got tons of friends that are, just like getting to experience those emotions in person. I'm excited for Georgia to make that trip.
Be careful what you wish for there, Kaylee, is all I will say.
Well, I mean, I'm not wishing for anything. They are going to South Carolina, Connor. It's not a wish. It's already happening. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us here on a Tuesday night. I'm sure we'll have more to discuss about this on DawgNation Daily with Brandon Adams, 10 a.m. tomorrow, and then, of course, Before the Hedges with myself and Jeff, and we'll have the visitors list for the Georgia-Alabama game this weekend. It'll be a big one. Connor, thank you so much for joining us. DawgNation, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow morning at 10 a.m.